So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about the readings, which you'll read and learn about this week. You're reading two histories that approach the field of writing assessment in very different ways. And you're going to then apply those histories to a recent opinion article about college-level writing. That opinion article isn't particularly of note. It's kind of got some garden variety things that people say about student writing all the time. If you tell somebody you're a teacher, they're probably going to say these students can't write anymore these days. And that's kind of a typical thing that we see when people think about college writing, if and when they think about it, particularly folks that don't teach. You've got two very different histories of assessment. They're going to approach it in very different ways. I do recommend that you read them in a particular order. I think reading the Hewitt, O'Neill, and Moore piece makes a lot more sense than beginning with the Ed White piece. And the reason why is that they, Hewitt, O'Neill, and Moore, they provide you a longer historical view. They go back a little bit further. They provide you a little bit more context. And they also describe key terms, the key terms of validity and reliability that provides a lot of the tension and disagreement in the field of writing assessment. So you'll learn what those two terms mean. The very short note, reliability means that two people are going, most times it means that two people are going to read the same thing and come away with the same score. They'll score it in the same way, which we know hilarity ensues when we assume that. And then validity means that the test that you have, it measures what you think it's going to measure. And there's several different forms of validity, and Hewitt, O'Neill, and Moore's piece do a really good job of giving you different ways to think about validity and different ways to think about reliability. So I'm just kind of boiling it down to what I think are really the key ways of, or the way most people are kind of thinking about validity and reliability. So they're taking a look at those two terms, and they're giving us a little bit more of a historical view. They also They touch upon something that I think is kind of interesting, and that's that the field of writing assessment right now, when we think about it, like the way that I teach this class, like it's about, it's kind of the teacher approach. It's a subdiscipline of composition studies, but the field of writing assessment actually got its beginnings in educational testing. So researchers in psychology and educational psychology coming up with exams that would test people's abilities. So we'll give you an example. When in the mid-90s, when I took the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, that was a psychological test that was going to tell the military this is the MOS, or the military occupational specialty, that this soldier is going to go into. So took the test and say these are the range of jobs that you can get into in the Army. So that's the kind of background that writing assessment has its origin story in. People coming up with those kind of exams to make kind of high stakes decisions about what people are going to do. So SAT, the ASVAB, there's a number of different kind of tests like that out there. Teachers, of course, push back, and Hewitt, O'Neill, and Moore, they're going to get to that, but teachers pushed back and approached. In this approach to assessing student writing, like the kind of the teacher approach and what teachers need out of an assessment, that is kind of like, that's where I come from when it comes to assessment. And that's kind of like the assumption that this class is going to come. This is not a math class. I'm not going to make you guys do statistical testing and things like that, although I kind of geek out on that stuff. But this is a class about the teacher side of assessing student writing. Hewitt, O'Neill, and Moore, they also make the point that the history of writing assessment is not one where things just get better all the time. And they've got a really good point that they make kind of towards the end of their article. I think this is on page 510. They write, as state-mandated writing assessments are now established for K-12 public institutions in all 50 states, the input from teachers is devalued, and the impact of these assessments is seen in high school curricula and in teachers in service. The impact of an untested and unexamined belief in test scores outweighs any other evidence in making important educational decisions about students. Yikes. There was a time where those tests did not have nearly as much sway, but those times are kind of long gone. Not to say that any time like things were going great, but testing is sure taking over a lot of the way we think about assessing student writing. Ed White's article, The Misuse of Writing Assessment for Political Purposes, looks at 3 key assessment practices or uses of assessment and explains why, how those assessment practices have been co-opted for kind of weird ends. And he's writing about high school proficiency tests, placement tests, like placing students in, like, is the student going to go into college level, like in developmental writing when they get to college, or are they going to be at like the credit bearing first year composition course? Or are they going to test out of it completely? So placement, and then mid-career college writing exams. When I was at San Francisco State as an undergraduate, they had something called the JEPIT, which was an exam that you took in your junior year to show that you knew how to write, and everyone hated it. And I think for good reason. And I think they've got also a good quote on page. So Ed White is writing about how those 3 practices, he gives you a little bit of the history of those practices and how those practices have been co-opted, again, for kind of weird ends. White's article also makes a really good point about the importance of assessment. And he's not making the case, and nobody that you're going to be reading, I don't think anybody that you're going to be reading this term is going to make the case like we should just not assess student writing at all. I don't, even the folks that advocate for ungrading, there's some point where you're kind of saying, all right, you did it or you didn't do it. But Ed White makes this case kind of at the end of his article. If we do not meet the academic and political demand for writing assessment at various levels, others will happily take on that task, whether they know anything about the matter or not. So if, I think the adage is assess thyself or thy shall be assessed. So unless you're actually learning about how your students are doing and finding ways to improve, other folks might try to do that at some point, and they might completely get it wrong. And it happens all the time, unfortunately. So those are the 2 histories. I think they're accessible. Hewitt, O'Neill, and Moore, it's a bit longer. It gets a little bit into the weeds. When they start talking about the different kinds of validity and reliability, I think that's pretty helpful stuff. So pay attention to that stuff for sure. Once you've read those 2 histories, you're going to read that short opinion piece about college writing, and comment on it in light of what you've learned from the 2 histories that you read. For that first assignment, and for several of the assignments that we're going to do in the class, you're going to use Perusal. So if you haven't used Perusal before, do use it for commenting on the syllabus. But I hope that you enjoy using that, because it really does kind of give you a sense of like how other folks are understanding the text. And if you've got questions, you can ask questions. So you're reading these 2 articles. The PDFs are in Blackboard, but you're commenting on that opinion piece in Perusal, and you're kind of bringing those 2 PDFs, the Ed White and the Brian Hewitt, Peggy O'Neill and Cindy Moore piece. You're using those to kind of inform your response to that opinion article in Perusal. If you get turned around, just send me an email. I'll get you squared away. But that's what we're doing for the first week. I'm looking forward to seeing what y'all think, and I'll be chatting with y'all soon.